It is not possible to understand the message of the infinite way or the practice of the infinite way unless we are able, first of all, to do some emptying out of our previous conceptions of metaphysics or spiritual wisdom. In my own experience, I had knowledge of only one teaching, and that was the Christian Science teaching. Since I have been out of the Christian Science movement, I have learned something of unity and something of New Thought, different branches of New Thought. Now, you will understand that in our work, as we refer to these other teachings, that not one single word is meant in criticism or judgment or condemnation. You will understand, first of all, that my first love is Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Science organization, and that will never change. I owe the deepest gratitude in the world to Mrs. Eddy and to the teaching and to the organization. And that will never change and never waver. And I have never had any fault to find with any of it so far as my relationships with it were concerned. So when I speak of the Christian Science teaching, please understand that I am not speaking of Mrs. Eddy or the organization, but I'm speaking of different points of revelation or unfoldment which the infinite way is not in agreement with, and upon which I had unfoldments while still a practitioner that led my practice to be different than Christian Science practice, and thereby became the foundation of the infinite way. So that you cannot look at the infinite way through Christian Science eyes and come into the principle as it is given. And all of this is said, remember, without one single word of judgment or criticism, because Christian Science stands on its own basis and survives because of its own integrity. It cannot be helped by any praise from me. It could never be hurt by any condemnation from me. And certainly there is none of the latter in my heart, soul, or mind. As far as unity is concerned, I have the greatest respect there also for the originators of that work, all of those who built that. But so far as the teaching is concerned, it is as far removed from the infinite way as day is removed from night. And if you have even a trace of thought that there is any resemblance between unity and the infinite way, you will have to do a good deal of clearing out on that subject. And of course we have nothing in common with the teaching of New Thought. Nothing in common except motive. We're all engaged in healing work, all engaged in bringing a higher light to humanity. But I mean, so far as the teaching and practice is concerned, there is nothing, practically nothing in agreement between any of the New Thought teachings and the infinite way. Now, I will briefly outline why this is so, and we might as well start with Christian Science. To begin with, in the infinite way, you are not a reflection and you are not an expression. In the infinite way, God is infinite, individual being. And therefore, God constitutes your being. All of you that is spiritual, eternal, and immortal is God being. God is being you. God manifests itself and expresses itself as you. Now, that of you, which is mortal, human, finite, is not a reflection or an expression of God. It is an illusion. It is not the truth of being. It is more a deflection of truth. Now, it is our humanhood that must die daily. It cannot be raised up to the atmosphere of Christhood. That which is human of us, finite, mortal, that of us which was born and must someday die, might just as well die in this minute in this room. There will be no funerals because of our death. There will be no corpse lying around because of our death. Because our death is not the death of a being, of a person, of an identity. Our death is the death of the false concepts of God and man that we have built up and that constitutes what we call human experience. We die daily to the human experience and are reborn into the spiritual experience. Now, that of you which is real, that of you which is eternal and immortal, is not a reflection. It is the Son of God. God is the Father, God is the Son, and God is the Holy Ghost. So God constitutes your being in the same sense that Jesus acknowledged his sonship with the Father. Yet he denied power to his humanhood. I can of my own self do nothing. And if I can of my own self do nothing, that's about as thorough and as complete a denial of your selfhood, of your own selfhood, as can be made. If Jesus could acknowledge, I can of my own self do nothing, if I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie, I hope we are not going to try to make a better demonstration than he did and claim something more of ourselves than he did. Now, he even went so far when he was called good master as to deny that. Why callest thou me good? There is but one good, the Father in heaven. Now it is on that the infinite way is based, on the fact that only God is real, and that God the Father appears individually as God the Son. And that spiritual identity is your real identity. Sonship. Manifestation. You see, if we were to say you express God, you would have a very strange relationship. You would be doing something. You would have some power of your own, even the power to express God, but you haven't. You have no power to express God. You have no power to reflect God. God being infinite, God alone can express itself. And God expressing itself is your individual identity and mind. You do not reflect God. You do not express God. God expresses himself as your individual being. It is God expressing, not man expressing. And God expressing becomes you and me in our spiritual identity. And yet, even with that sonship, God always is the presence and God always is the power. Never do you have power. Never. All power is God power as it flows forth from the Godhead, appearing as our individual capacities. It is still the capacity of God, and that's why it is infinite. If it ever became your capacity or mine, it would be limited to us. But as you understand that all capacity is God capacity, then all capacity remains God and remains infinite. And that is why Jesus, through the full understanding or demonstration of that, could be the avenue through which the fullness of God's power could be made manifest on earth. Not Jesus' power. I can of my own self do nothing. The fullness of God's power was made evident through Jesus because he thoroughly understood his own nothingness and made himself that instrument through which the allness of God could appear. Now, in some degree, we can do that. There may even be those appear on earth who may duplicate the work of the Master and show forth God's allness in its completeness. We don't know of its ever having been done, but we may never know of its having been done even if it is done, because the higher a person goes in spiritual awareness, as a rule, the further they retire from the human scene. And so their accomplishments may be more in the invisible than in the visible. But so far as potentiality is concerned, anyone who can sufficiently understand the nothingness of humanhood can, in that degree, show forth the evidence or bear witness to God's allness. Now, again, the infinite way gives no outlet or opportunity for ritual, for ceremony, for rite, or for creed. The infinite way merely states as clearly as I have apprehended it, the revelation of the Master, and then leaves everyone free to demonstrate it in accord with their own capacity of understanding and demonstrating it. Now, by that I mean this. There is a place in the life of every individual for some form of ceremony or ritual in their own experience. But the ceremony or rite or ritual that may appeal to me and enhance my development may be a hindrance to you. And that which may do wonders for you may be a hindrance to me. And therefore, each one in the infinite way is free to find their own means of development. For instance, we have no such thing as a communion service or a Thanksgiving service or an Easter service. And the reason is this. It is not a disrespect for those activities, but it is to set every individual free to have them in their own way. For instance, I find it impossible to get on my knees in public. I find it impossible to give any outward sign of worship. And yet there have been times in the privacy of my bedroom or my study room when I have been on my knees for hours and tears flowing freely. But I would hate very much to have to be told to do that on Sunday and in company. Those are ceremonies or rites that I reserve for my own relationship with God. I find it impossible to pray in public except to sit with closed eyes. Why? Because the relationship between God and the individual is not only sacred, but it's secret. And it's different in every case. And no two people can pray alike. No two people can worship God alike. And no one individual can worship God 2 days in the 2 succeeding days in the same way. Now, it may well be that you might like to have a little incense burn in your home or in your office, and that may be very offensive to another student. Well, then why not have your incense in your home and let your fellow student have none if that's their desire? It may well be that one person finds spiritual light through music, through songs, through hymns. To me, that has always been a hindrance, because the emotions are aroused. And the moment the emotions are aroused, there comes the false concepts that are brought up in one's own being. It is very much like the sentimental slush music that passes for music in Tin Pan Alley and real music. Now, real music does not appeal to the baser or more carnal sentiments the way Tin Pan Alley does. And it's for that reason that it is music and the other isn't music. On the other hand, we are not going to pass a rule that those people who like Tin Pan Alley shall not have Tin Pan Alley. Nor will we make a rule that all of us must have symphonies. And so we will have no music, and then allow each individual to have music or not have music, or to choose their own type of music. Now, it is the same thing with Scripture. There are wonderful things in the Old Testament if you can rightly interpret them. There are some pretty horrible things there if you take them in their literal sense. The New Testament is very confusing, has always confused the world, and some of it, taken in its literal sense, would make no sense to us. Other parts of it, taken literally, mean a great deal. Now then, in all of my years in Christian Science, the Bible was a closed book to me. I read it. I did my lesson. I knew all the passages that were in it. But there were only 2 statements that I can truthfully say that I understood. One of them was in Isaiah. Cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostril, for wherein is he to be accounted of? I caught a vision of what that meant, and that is what made my practice what it really was. And the second was the statement of the Master, my kingdom is not of this world. I understood that too, because I caught a glimpse of the spiritual kingdom. And I knew then that there was no use trying to patch up a human world. Now, aside from that, there were passages in the Bible that I loved very much and that I understood as poetry, but that had no actual meaning to me. And it was only after I was out of Christian Science movement and expected to spend the rest of my days in California just doing a little healing work and staying quietly at home and enjoying the whatever is left of California weather in California. And that was my idea when I resigned from the Christian Science movement. The book, The Infinite Way, was published, And I never expected it to amount to very much. We only had 2,000 copies printed. And even then, I often wondered what was going to happen to the other 1,500 copies. I had no idea that it would be seriously taken by anybody but myself and a few friends, patients who had benefited through it. And that is the way I dreamed of the rest of my days. Every day I was over at the farmer's market for a salad and iced tea. It was a very happy experience, but it didn't last long. And it was broken when a mother, father, and son drove out to California from Ohio and said, well, now that you're not in Christian Science anymore, we'd like you to give us class instruction. Oh, that's impossible. I'm not a teacher. Well, but you're not in Christian Science, so you can teach. Well, how can you teach if you're not a teacher, whether you're in or out? And I'm not a teacher. Well, you know something that we want to know. I can't imagine what it is. Well, it ended up anyhow by my consenting, as long as they had made the trip out there, to have them come into my home and for 2 weeks at night, and I do the best I could with them, and I did. When they left, they were very grateful, thought they'd have gotten a great deal, and left me a check for $300, which was class instruction fee in Christian Science. So it was a mystery to me. I couldn't understand it. But I thought, well, that's all right. They're three good friends, and that's that. But a few days later, 4 couples came to me and asked if I would teach them the Bible. Now, they came just to the right person. I knew 2 statements in the Bible. And I said, I can't teach you the Bible. I don't. Oh, no, we know you must know something that you haven't told us. No. Well, they gave me no rest for weeks until I said, well, the only one way to end it, and that is, let's pick out one night, and for 4 weeks we'll take that one night a week, and I assure you that by that time you'll know that I don't know enough of the Bible to teach you. And that's the way we started. And so on the very first Friday night, 8 people, 4 married couples, came to my home. But a few days before that, I went to my office. I thought, look, Father, if you've sent these people to me, it must be for a reason. Tell me what it is. If you didn't send them, that's all right. Within 4 weeks, they'll know all about it. But if you sent them, let me in on the secret. What are they here for? What is it you want me to do? And that's why I say also, nobody can pray the same way twice, and no 2 people can pray alike. But that's how I prayed over this thing of the Bible. I just talked to Father as if Father was another man. That isn't very scientific, but that was my way. And that's the way I still talk to Father. And so I sat with the Bible in my hand, waited, and finally I opened the Bible. And I found myself reading something about Moses. And if ever there was a mystery to me, it was the man Moses and the flight out of Egypt and across the desert and 40 years of travel. And so, as I saw myself reading about Moses, I thought, there's no use of doing this. Let's go back to the beginning of Moses, and I'll read it all the way through, and I did. When I came to the 10 Commandments, that's where I got my shock. I read those 10 Commandments, and I thought, how can God be telling somebody not to steal, or not to commit adultery, or not to be envious, or not to be jealous? What is spiritual about that? After you don't steal or don't commit adultery, what then? Are you anywhere nearer the kingdom of heaven than you were before? No, I know lots of honest people in the world that aren't anywhere near spiritual understanding. I know loads of people that never even thought about committing adultery or being envious, but I don't see anything spiritual about them. Now, what is this? And it seemed to me that Moses was dealing with a very ignorant or illiterate state of thought, and that he was trying at least to make them good humans. Maybe that was a step. Oh, and that was the cue. Maybe that was a step. And then I remembered, the law came by Moses, but truth came by Christ Jesus. There we are. There we are. First must come the law. First you've at least got to know something about being a decent human and have some kind of a principle about you or some kind of integrity before the spiritual light can enter. And so when we met on the first Friday night, our friends were very shocked when I told them that the ministry of Moses was a human ministry leading ignorance and superstition, illiteracy out of itself into a preparation for something better. And that is why Moses didn't get into the promised land, because your good humanhood will never take you into the promised land. Your good humanhood is a preparation for it, but then your teacher who's told you about being good has to leave you. And the spiritual one has to come along to lift you into divine consciousness. And that was the subject of our first lesson. Well, 3 couples thought it was wonderful. And the other one thought it was shocking, and they dropped out. But the next Friday night, 4 new couples took the place of the 1 couple that dropped out because of what they'd heard from the first 3. But before that came along, I again went back and said, well, Father, where do we go from here? If that was you that started me off last week, I think you did all right. But if it was you, then you've got something for me this week. When I opened the Bible, it was to the story of Ruth and Naomi. Well, I've read that many times, and I think it's beautiful. And no doubt that that passage I will never, entreat me not to leave thee. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of work in literature. But where is the spiritual message in it? I read it and read it several times over, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me. Naomi never was a woman, and Ruth never was a woman. Naomi went down from Bethlehem, which is the spiritual center, and became immersed in materiality and was very successful at it too. Acquired a husband and sons and lands and cattle. She was very, very successful in her materiality until, as always happens, materiality comes to an end and bursts. And eventually we find this state of material prosperity becoming material poverty. And then Naomi finds herself with a daughter-in-law. Our daughter-in-law isn't anything very important. The daughter-in-law isn't too great in a person's life, not nearly as great as a son would be or a daughter. And here is this, and not only it was only a daughter-in-law, but it was the daughter-in-law that belonged to a foreign tribe, not even one of our own household. So you might say that Ruth was the least of these. And that's all that Naomi's left with, the least of these, something that isn't considered very great. Yes, but that which was not considered very great, which was only a daughter-in-law and only a foreigner, turns out to be that which will never leave us nor forsake us. Now, can you imagine anything in the world that will never leave us nor forsake us? Do you know of anybody in your life that will never leave you nor forsake you? Be very careful, because your mother and your father may, and your children surely may. So don't lay claim to any human being on this earth that you really cannot hope or believe will never leave you nor forsake you. And certainly not husband, and certainly not wife. What then is it that will never leave you nor forsake you? Certainly not wealth, That has left too many people. Fame, that has left too many people. What is there left now that actually will never leave you nor forsake you? And as you get deep down silent within your own being, you'll come to the realization there's only one thing, and that's myself. That's me, the better part of me. Because even if I go down to the gutter in sin, there'll be a part of me in here aching about it and wanting to rise up again, and you recognize that that's your Christhood. It doesn't make any difference if you walk the streets hungry and without a dime. There'll be a little corner of you in there saying, don't you care, we're going to get out of this yet. There is a way out. That's your Christhood. It makes no difference if you're in bed on your last illness. Something inside of you is going to say, it doesn't make any difference. If you die, I'll be right there to wake you up. And you will find that there is something within you, actually, that never leaves you and never forsakes you. It was with you before Abraham. It will be with you to the end of the world. And then you'll know that Naomi had found her Christ. And that was the revelation in that second message. Well, we went on, and after the 4th week they decided to extend it to 10 weeks. But by that time, there were 32 people meeting, and that's all we could accommodate. So we had to have 2 nights in the week. And then we had to move to an office that accommodated 50. And then we had to have 3 nights a week. And we ended up with an office of 50 people 5 nights a week, and 2 nights a week more either in San Francisco or down on the desert. And with each one of those meetings, there came an unfoldment of some passage or some story of the Bible, and that resulted in the book Spiritual Interpretation of Scripture, and in turn it has resulted in all of these interpretations that you'll find throughout the writings. Now, this I tell you, never at any time have I explained a Bible passage unless it was given me of the Father. Throughout all these years in all of these cities, there have been requests in every class for me to talk about the Sermon on the Mount or explain the Sermon on the Mount. And always I have said, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the Sermon on the Mount. I don't understand the Sermon on the Mount. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm sure it has a spiritual import, but I don't know it, and I can't explain it, and I'm not going to be a phony. You'll have to get it somewhere else or get it yourself, until it is given to me. Well, when we were in Honolulu in this last class in June, 2 days before the class, the Father said, you are to have the Sermon on the Mount. And on the first day of the class, the Father said, in 2 days you will have the Sermon on the Mount, and 2 days later we had the Sermon on the Mount. And it's included in our recordings of this last Honolulu class. And it's a very astonishing one from my standpoint. What it'll do to anybody else, I don't know. But now, I tell you this, you see, so that you will see that I am not presenting in the infinite way, or rather the infinite way is not presenting some other teaching or some other revelation. It is an unfoldment that is individual with me, that has come through, and there are parts of it that agree with all teachings. You know, it was Swedenborg who gave the world the first spiritual interpretation of the Bible. He had first Genesis and then Revelation. And some of his unfoldment is found in the Christian Science textbook in the chapters in the back of the book, Genesis and Apocalypse. And they are so clear on this unfoldment of God that anyone who would have a spiritual interpretation would be in agreement with them. You couldn't have a spiritual interpretation and disagree with truth. But aside from that, you will see, and this was not taken from it, this came as unfoldment and continues. It was only within this very week that the passage came that I gave you the other night about man shall not prevail by strength, and that the Lord overcomes his adversaries. It was then that I saw clearly within this last week that you can't have a problem, that I can't have a problem. They're all God's problems, and it's God that overcomes them. It is you and I claiming them that makes them impossible of solution, because you and I have no solution to our problem. We never will have. Unless we find God overcoming them, we're going to stay in them. Now then, in an experience back in 1932, about my second year in the practice, I found a passage in Science and Health with which I couldn't agree. The passage was that the procuring cause and foundation of all disease is ignorance, sin, and fear. And that set me off on meditation, pondering, thinking, studying, until I could get a clear perspective. And what came ultimately was this, that was part of a mental science, just as Quimby originally had, and which has been continued in Unity and New Thought, in which you examine your thought to see what errors you're holding, and then try to get rid of them. And at one time, Mrs. Eddy published a list of mental causes for physical diseases, and her practitioners had it. But when she herself realized that that was wrong, she called them in, and all but one of her teachers sent them in, and that one refused, and he based his teaching on that list. That was Mr. Kimball. He still perpetuated the teaching, which still exists in Christian Science, of a mental cause for a physical disease. Now, that was my first separation from Christian Science teaching, conscious separation, because it was right there that I saw you cannot practice that way successfully. If there is any reality or causative power in a wrong thought, how are you going to say there's no reality in a disease, if disease is the product of the wrong thought? One must be as real as the other, or one must be as unreal as the other. And so if you are to say that disease is not real and has no power, you must go back and say that wrong thinking is not real and has no power. Now then, the infinite way in its practice, in its healing work, differs from every metaphysical teaching known today on that point. The infinite way will not search your thought or permit you to search it to see what is wrong in your thinking, but rather it will say, regardless of what wrong thinking you're doing, regardless of what sin you're committing, regardless of any error in your understanding, it isn't power. God alone is power. And with the understanding of God alone as power, you will not only be healed of your disease, you'll be healed of the wrong thinking that may have, in the human picture, produced it. For instance, if you say that worry causes ulcers, then there's no way of curing ulcers unless you can cure worry. Well, now, if you go to a man who's got about 5 children and earns $40 a week, you're going to sentence him to ulcers forever, because you can't take him out of his worry. He's got a big worry on his hands forever, supporting his 5 children on $40 a week in this modern age. And so you're really sentencing him forever to ulcers. Well, don't do it. Since ulcers themselves represent an illusory experience, a false sense of existence, then even the thought that claimed to produce them must be as powerless as the disease itself. Well, you know, there was a physician in Los Angeles who built a wonderful reputation on treating ulcers. He had 100% record of cures, but he refused to tell for many years what the secret of it was until the press got a hold of it and really forced him into the open. And then he called it in one day and he said, as long as you must know and are making such a to-do about it, I'll tell you, I treat ulcers with a hypodermic injection of water and a prayer. In other words, he recognized no power. He recognized no power in ulcers and no power in the thought that caused ulcers. And in his recognition of no power, he recognized the all power of whatever it is. He may have called it nature. He may have said that nature heals itself. But whatever he called it, it was God maintaining its own integrity. Now, watch this, because this is one of the most important points in the practice of spiritual healing in the infinite way. You do not have a cause for disease. You don't have a disease and you don't have a cause for disease. And we will come to that again. Again, in the infinite way, you do not have a patient, so that you never call a patient by name, nor do you ever address your treatment to a patient, nor do you ever hold a patient in thought when you are treating, so that you neither have the name of a disease and you have no name of a patient, and in no other metaphysical teaching is that true. Never do you send out a good thought to your patient. Never do you hold a good thought for your patient. Never do you accept the patient. You may say to the individual who calls you for help, I will give it to you. But that's as far as you can go, as far as having a patient is concerned. From that second on, you give up your patient. And so you never hold a right thought for them. You never send a loving thought to them. You never hold them in the light of truth. You never address truth to them. And you never give them a treatment. Never, never, never. It's a sin in the infinite way to give anybody a treatment. Never give anybody a treatment. There's only one person in the infinite way who ever gets a treatment. That's God. Only God. Our entire treatment is in God. If you ask me for help, my thought immediately takes hold of the word God. Now, God is infinite. God is spirit. God is love. God is life. God is all-inclusive being. And that's where my treatment stays. Now then, you may have asked for help, let us say, for a hereditary disease. You may have mentioned it. Of course, if you don't mention the nature of the claim, and I particularly don't want you to, unless it will help to relieve you by getting it off your mind, then you can throw it right at me, but I won't be listening. But if I do happen to hear that you said it was hereditary, I would immediately stay up there with God, knowing God to be the only father, mother, and of course then all that we can inherit from the father and the mother is all that the father has. Son, all that I have is thine, and that's a beautiful inheritance. But ordinarily, people get to where they do not speak to me about their symptoms or diagnosis. Sometimes they do, and I promptly forget it. But it's better to work without it, because I'm not in the business of healing human beings. I'm not in the business of employing human beings or getting them out of trouble. My business, and my only business, is realizing God as individual beings. Now, when we come to the subject of God as one, we will follow through on that in a deeper sense than we are this minute, because I'm using this morning only to outline and to clear out some of your older forms of practice, because they won't mix with the infinite way. So that if you have at all any thought in your mind about somebody's wrong thinking, don't carry it over into the infinite way practice, because it will confuse and it will prevent harmony. With us, there must be a correct letter of truth according to the infinite way unfoldment. So we will have no mental cause for physical disease. Now again, I think you'll find in metaphysical teachings that sin is a great boogaboo, and you must look out for sin, because you probably won't get healed while you're sinning. Don't you ever believe that? Don't you ever believe that? As a matter of fact, I would like to go just a little bit further and say to you that the easiest people to heal are the sinners. I'd much rather have a juicy dozen of those than I would 1,000 very righteous good men and women. It's very difficult to break through that human sense of, well, I deserve to be well. Look at all the money I've given to charity, and I've devoted my life to church work. You can't break through that. It's difficult. I won't say you can't, but it's difficult. Whereas a sinner comes right out and says, you know, I really want this healing. I know I'm not deserving it, I'm not worthy of it, but at least I'll come clean with you. I'd like to be. And you've really got a chance there, because they've announced the nothingness of themselves. They know the nothingness and the worthlessness of the human picture. And that's what those who really believe they're good humans have someday got to learn, that their goodness won't get them very far unless it goes higher than the goodness of the scribes and the Pharisees, who were indeed righteous. Now then, we don't take sin or sinners into consideration in our work. When we get a call for help, we never ask anyone whether they're stealing or cheating on their income tax or committing adultery. That's not our business. That is the business of the individual. As spirit touches them, they lose the power to sin. But just humanly trying to be a good human and get over their bad habits will not advance them spiritually. Therefore, when they call up and say that they are ill, we do not go into their personal history. We do not ask about their wrong thinking or about their sins. We start with the word God, and we understand God to be the universal principle of life, and we understand that God is that universal principle of life without exception. Now, where do we get authority for that in the infinite way? And I will tell you that if there were no authority for it, it still would be the principle of the infinite way, because that is what was revealed to me. But we do have authority, the best authority in the world, and that is the authority of Jesus Christ. At no point did he ever tell anyone that they couldn't be healed because they were committing adultery or being a prostitute or being a thief or having inherited venereal disease. At no point did he say those things. He said, neither do I judge thee, neither do I condemn thee. He talked about forgiveness until 70 times 7. Those are the things he talked about. Never holding a person in condemnation to their faults, but forgiving them. Well, but suppose they do it again tomorrow. Well, he said if they do it 7 times in a day, forgive them 7 times. Every day. That's very hard for the good people to see. But it's necessary. I can see it easily because I haven't been one of the good ones. So I have very great sympathy for the sinner. Now then, and I've been forgiven a few too. Now, The point is this, that our practice does not deal with psychology, nor does it deal with turning out a race of better humans. I want to make this very clear, that infinite way healing is never thought of in terms of making sick people well or bad people good or poor people rich. When we go into meditation, the purpose is realizing Christ. That's the only purpose of our treatment, realizing Christ. When I can look at you and not see you humanly, not be concerned with whether you're male or female, young or old, when I can look at you and look through the appearance and begin to feel you, the real you, that is when I am discerning Christ. That's when healing takes place. As long as there is a thought of you in my mind as a human being, I cannot bring out the right results. I have had cases of people in the 80s and in the 90s, and I have seen them restored beautifully to health and to what we would call vitality, strength. Only in one way. Certainly not by looking on them in the 80s and 90s and saying, well, I know, but it's about time for you to be this way. No, 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 no. No, one way only. Do you really believe that a 1-year-old child is any more in the sight of God than a 90-year-old person? Then why should God give any more health, strength, and youth to 1 year of age than to 90 years of age? Now, you can't prove that humanly. There's only one way you can prove that, spiritually. If you will completely leave your patient out of your thought and turn to God for the realization of divine sonship, the Christ, then it makes no difference whether your patient is 1 year, 21 years, or 91 years. All would make no difference in the world. The result would be the same, the restoration of harmony, the resurrection from physical sense of life to the ascension into the spiritual. You will find this also in the treatment of insanity, alcoholism, or people who are unconscious or in a coma. The moment that you would try to make an insane person sane, the moment you would try to reason with them and want them to understand truth, you'd lose your case. Or supposing it were a cat or a dog, and you couldn't give it the Lord's Prayer to recite, or an affirmation to go over 100 times. How are you going to heal a cat or a dog? How are you going to do it with an infant? Now you see, that is where the infinite way stands. It takes into consideration no infant, no age, no insane, no cat, dog, or bird. It just takes into consideration God and God's infinite manifestation of its own being, and it rests there. Now, I have seen miracles in this work. I mean, miracles to our human sense. In my prison work, I've had experiences here recently in Hawaii in the prison that if my hair weren't getting gray of itself, it would make it gray. Just the things that I've witnessed there. But for one reason, let me just illustrate this. In the prison in Hawaii, they have a system of teaching. And they have teachers, authorized teachers from the schools, who volunteer their services to teach the boys at night. And every night there are 3, 4, 5 classes: public speaking, English, writing, music, all of the different things that boys might possibly be interested in prison as well as out. And of course, these boys not only are graded, but with every subject they take and pass, they are credited with some time off on their prison sentence. And you can imagine that these boys are pretty serious about it, and pretty earnest. And so one of our students was the teacher of public speaking in Oahu prison. And one evening, she read from the booklet, Secret of the 23rd Psalm, because there's a little poetic rhythm in there. And one of the boys said, "Hey, what is that you're reading? That sounds interesting." So she passed it to him, and he sat there and read it. He said, "Can I have a copy of this?" Well, she said, "You can have that copy, and I'll get another one." And so he passed it to another fellow, and before that class was over that evening, 4 of them had either read it all or read parts of it and wanted copies. So the next week, we gave this lady half a dozen or so copies of it. And when she went there the following week, there were 18 boys who wanted copies of it. Well, that constituted her whole class. And so by that time, she had given them love and gratitude. And then they wanted to know, who is this thing? What is this thing? And it ended up by my being invited there on one of her evenings to talk to the boys on religion. She gave up her teaching class on public speaking so that they could hear something on religion. And this group of 18 boys was to be there. And when I got there, the man who was in charge of the teaching work in the prison said, "Well, something unusual has come up, and so I want to talk to you about it." He said, "Instead of 18, there's going to be 66. The other boys read some of those pamphlets, and they asked if their classes couldn't be called off so they could hear about it." Now, he said, "I'll tell you, I've read The Infinite Way, and I know how difficult it is to understand, so I'll tell you now that they won't understand you. And the class is supposed to be for 2 hours, and you'll be lucky to hold them 15 minutes. So the minute you feel that they're slipping or you're slipping, just give me the high sign, and we'll call a break for a rest, and then I'll have them continue on with public speaking for the rest of the evening." That was very kind, and I would certainly listen. And got before the boys. The vast majority of them were Orientals, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, mixtures, Hawaiians, their kinds of mixtures, and a few white. And at the end of an hour, there's supposed to be a break for smoking and walking around, but they wouldn't have it. They insisted that that be for questions. And at the end of the 2 hours, they wouldn't break up, and the wardens had to come in and tell them they had to break up. The evening was over. And the request for books from those boys and the request for a return started my prison work down there. And with that for a beginning, and that's a miracle in and of itself, this man came to me afterward and said, "The first time I have ever seen any religious teaching hold men for 2 hours," and he said, "You had them in the palm of your hand. I suspect you hypnotized them." Now, the secret of it, I will tell you, because you can go and do likewise, and you don't have to wait to put it into practice. You can do it the minute you leave this room. You might put it into practice the minute I tell it to you. I am not a man, though I seem so to be to you. I'm not a human being, although I have all the appearance of it, to you. God is my father and my mother. and I am the offspring of God. And I embody all of the qualities of God. And there is nothing about me except that which God has given me. And God has given me not part of himself, but all of himself. Son, all that I have is thine. And thou art ever with me. So I'm always with the Father, in the Father, though you think I'm sitting here in a chair. I'm not. I'm with the Father, in the Father, and the Father is in me. And I am in you, and you are in me. We are all one. And so I'm not a man, and I'm not a woman, and I'm not a male, and I'm not a female, though that is the appearance to the world. Christ is my true identity. And that's all there is of me that's real. And anything else that you are beholding isn't real. It's a picture. It's a dream. I'm having part of that dream as well as you, but it's a dream. Now then, because I know this about myself, and because I know that God doesn't pick out any individual in the world to make an exception of, I know that it's true of you.